I'll say a few words of introduction in just a moment, but a couple of our usual announcements. So next month on November 8th, we will hear from Wall Street Journal reporter and author Amy Doxer Marcus, who is going to be discussing her book focused on patient advocacy and medical research. We've had a cancellation in December, so we'll be back again on January 10th with a lecture from Jonathan Kimmelman on assessing the scientific case for early phase trials and innovative care. And as always, I would encourage you, although our list of prospective invitees to this series is long, if there are folks that we should consider inviting, especially individuals from diverse backgrounds or who could contribute diverse perspectives to issues relevant to research ethics and policy, please send their names our way. A quick reminder about some of the online resources from our department, including a short research ethics course available for free continuing education credit, and a thank you to our various co-sponsors, all of whom are shown here, and a special thanks to Lisa Bailey, who is our reps coordinator. So now let me move on to introducing Dr. Garrison, who is an associate professor at UCLA, where she has appointments in the Institute for Society and Genetics, the Institute for Precision Health, and the Division of General Internal Medicine and Health Services Research. She's a bioethicist and a geneticist, engaged in research to explore perspectives of tribal leaders, physicians, scientists, and policymakers on genetic research with tribes. Using community-based research approaches, she engages with tribal communities to develop policies and guidance. We are especially excited to have Dr. Garrison with us after a few years of planning and rescheduling. It just so happens that we were able to finally make the visit happen this week on the week of Indigenous Peoples Day, which was Monday, which is especially appropriate given Dr. Garrison's identity as a member of the Navajo Nation, her expansive service to that community, and of course, the topic of today's talk. We've invited Dr. Garrison to give this year's Bronstein Lecture, which is an endowed lecture intended to explore the wide range of ethical issues in research and medicine raised by the Holocaust. Given the terrible history of Indigenous genocide in the U.S., and its ongoing legacy, including substantial challenges relevant to Indigenous health and research, we're grateful to be able to honor Dr. Garrison through this important lecture. Now, I've also discussed with Dr. Garrison that we would begin today's session with a land acknowledgement. And to do that, I've relied on a statement that's posted on the Penn Anthropology Department's website. And the statement reads, "We recognize and acknowledge that the University of Pennsylvania stands on the Indigenous territory known as Lenape-Hocking, the traditional homelands of the Lenape people, also called Lenni Lenape or Delaware Indians. These are people who, during the 1680s, negotiated with William Penn to facilitate the founding of the colony of Pennsylvania. Their descendants today include the Delaware Tribe and Delaware Nation of Oklahoma, the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape, the Ramapo Lenape, and the Powhatan Lenape of New Jersey, and the Munsee Delaware of Ontario." And with that, I'm excited to welcome you up, and just a word about how we'll handle questions and discussion. Those of you who are online are welcome to put your comments in the chat or raise your hand and we can call on you to read your comments out on your own. And we are recording this session today and we'll be able to post the video soon. Okay, please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Holly, Professor Fernandez-Lynch, and also thank you to Steve Jockey for the invitation to come out here to Penn. I do want to start by also recognizing the lands that I work on. I'm currently at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, which is on the homelands of the Tovangar, or homelands of the Tongva people, and their lands are called the Tovangar. And this is also the lands of the San Gabrielino peoples. I myself am from the Navajo Nation, and some of these photos depict the landscape from where I'm from. And I am from the Navajo tribe. My people have been there for many generations, and my mother's whole ancestral line is from the Navajo as well. And so with that, I also, to say hello in my language, Yate is our way of greeting each other when we see each other. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that this week was Indigenous Peoples Day. And so it's very fitting to be here to talk about my work. And I'm really excited to share my experiences. My experiences in my research is also very much informed by my worldviews and my cultural upbringing and the traditional knowledge that has been passed on to me. I want to start by talking a little bit about the Havasupai tribe's experiences with genetic research, because this has really shaped a lot of the work that I do. And the Havasupai tribe are another tribe in the Southwest. They are located in the bottom of the Grand Canyon and have really been impacted by diabetes in their community. And they had asked a researcher from Arizona State University to help them understand the cause of diabetes and the high rates of diabetes in their community, and received institutional review board approval from Arizona State University to conduct this work. An informed consent process was conducted with them to look at behavioral/medical problems, and about 400 individuals agreed to participate in this study. Unfortunately, there were inconclusive results from the diabetes study, and samples were shared with other researchers. Studies were conducted on other topics that are not related to diabetes, such as schizophrenia, inbreeding, and migration. And then the tribe sued the researchers at Arizona State University. This case got a lot of media attention, and in the end, the case was settled, where samples were returned back to the community, and monetary compensation was given to the community members in the amount of $700,000. So the reason I'm starting with this is because this is a backdrop for a lot of the reasons why there might be some hesitation for Indigenous peoples to participate in genetic research. And a lot of my motivation to do this work is to try to find ways to facilitate better communication, to break down some of these barriers and move the work forward. So when thinking about the representation of Indigenous peoples in genetic research studies, you can see that there's based on an estimate done in 2009, 96% of all genome-wide association studies were comprised of people primarily of European descent. And although by 2016, there has been some diversification in genome-wide association studies, the percentage of Indigenous peoples is actually a very small part of that blue sliver. Most of the growth that you see in diversity has happened in Asian countries. And based on estimates from several different reports, the percentage of Indigenous peoples in genome-wide association studies has hovered between 0.06% and 0.02%. So there's a lot of work to be done to think about ways to increase those numbers and those percentages. So there's a lot of potential reasons for this low representation. Some of them might stem from historical distrust, from perceived lack of benefits to individuals and to communities, to concerns that might challenge a person's beliefs about who they are and where they are from and how they are related to each other. There's also the case that a lot of Indigenous peoples have other pressing health priorities and needs, and genetics is not up there. Research is also not a priority for many people. And there's concerns over secondary use of findings, what additional research can be done. So thinking about the Havasupai case, if research results are being used for additional purposes that are not part of the original intended purpose, that has created a lot of concern for people. And there's also concerns about what might happen to data or biospecimens after a research study ends, or after a person has moved on to the next world, or to after a participant's death. So to really try to understand some of the reasons in a more empirical way, I conducted a study where I recruited people who were tribal leaders, health professionals, and policy experts to think about what their perspectives were on genetics and genomic research, as well as whether they had particular thoughts around data sharing, biospecimen use, and other topics related to genetics. And so the individuals who I interviewed in this study were tribal leaders who had some sort of way of making influential decisions within their tribal community. which could be elected officials or tribal elders or tribal other people in tribal leadership roles. I also talked to people who were health professionals who had advanced degrees in some sort of biomedical science, and maybe they were scientists, researchers, health board, policy members, epidemiologists, clinicians, and other people with similar types of backgrounds. And I also engaged people who had policy expertise through such as people who are policymakers or tribal institutional review board members. And so the demographics of that group are primarily people with advanced degrees. And so I won't go through the entire table, but you can see towards the middle that about 90% of the individuals I interviewed in this study were people with advanced degrees. And most of the people felt like they had more knowledge about genetics than others. And this was sort of a self-assessment of how much they felt like they knew. In asking the people in this study whether or not tribes should share data and how that data sharing should happen, there was a mix of views about whether tribes should share data. Some individuals said that as long as there are assurances that the information is in fact de-identified, then maybe it's okay to share data. And others were kind of going back and forth. Well, maybe I would encourage it, but I would never impose it on another tribe if they aren't comfortable with sharing certain types of information. And then other individuals said that tribes should not share data. And one person in particular said that I have ensured that none of the data or biological samples of any of the projects that I have conducted in the past with tribes have ever been placed into an NIH federally sponsored repository. So there's a range of views about whether or not data should be shared. And when thinking a little further about how that should happen, there was a range of views on data oversight. Some individuals thought that tribes should have oversight over their data because they should absolutely manage the use of the data. It should never be an academic partner or a research partner. But on the flip side, some individuals said that for practical purposes, maybe these are reasons because of infrastructure, lack of infrastructure. Data should be protected and controlled by the researcher or research institution, but should be based on a agreed upon consent by the tribe. So a lot of the individuals I talked to in these interviews said things like it would be ideal for the tribe to have control over how these samples are managed or how these data are used, but we don't necessarily have the right infrastructure in place or the right mechanisms to make sure that the data are not going to be misused, even if it is within our tribal lands. So this actually motivated some of the work that I conducted with some faculty members who are part of the summer internship for Indigenous peoples in genomics to think about ways to engage community members who come from diverse backgrounds and Indigenous backgrounds in doing research ethically. And so we developed a framework that really thinks about sovereignty and research regulation at its core. This is represented in the middle of the circle here, that it's so important to understand the existing regulatory mechanisms that different tribal communities have, or that different communities of color have in thinking about whether or not research could be approved or should be approved in their communities. And it's important to also encompass that with community engagement and making sure that community engagement happens at all parts of the research process, that it touches on all aspects of it. And then if you follow this diagram, starting on the right-hand side, we start with cultural competency as being an important piece of making sure that researchers who go into different communities understand the cultural backgrounds, the cultural perspectives, and the values that are important for the people in that community. And then moving down to the bottom of the circle, we're going to go in a clockwise circle here. There's transparency, which is really important to people to understand what the purpose of a research project is, to understand the goals and how research will unfold in that community. Going over to the left-hand side, we built in capacity building into this model, as it is important to not just go into communities to conduct research, but you also want to think about ways to engage the community members in ways that they can actually help to influence and shape the research question. Maybe they can help to analyze data, or they can help with recruitment, or they can help with really helping you think about the broader impacts of your work. And so by doing different types of training or bringing people from the community into the research setting, there's an opportunity to do capacity building within that community. And then towards the top, we put in dissemination or sharing of research findings, and this should be done in a culturally acceptable or appropriate manner so that the research findings are put in the context that the community members can understand and appreciate and use. Also in this model, we added in aspects of bioethics principles, and some of these principles are inspired by the Belmont Report, which have respect for persons or respect for individuals and community members as one part of the spoke. And on the opposite side of that is beneficence, thinking about the benefits to people more broadly. And then on the other side of the spoke, we have equity, which is inspired by the principle of justice, making sure that research findings are equitable and fair, that the entire research process is done in an equitable and fair way. And then reciprocity is the idea that there should be more of a back and forth, a give and take, rather than a more extractive way of doing research where people come into a community and take samples and leave and not come back. There should be much more of a reciprocal way of engaging community members in research. So this has led to some additional broader questions about how do we move institutions from extractive, transactional, colonial data practices and reconfigure power relations to put Indigenous data into Indigenous hands, recognizing that there's also a need to build more infrastructure, a need to build more capacity, a need to train more people to think about how to handle data responsibly and do so in a way that is empowering Indigenous people. So some of the collaborative work that I've been doing with other people at the University of Arizona and Colorado State are to look at Indigenous ethics guidelines. And so this slide was actually a compilation of Indigenous ethics guidelines. You don't need to look at it super carefully. It's just a pretty slide to put up, but it showcases that there's a lot of different guidelines that have been put together by different Indigenous groups to think about best practices or to think about considerations or guidelines for conducting research within their communities. Some of these are not just about research, but are on health-related work as well that could have an impact on research. And so I was struggling with thinking about how do we think about making sure that Indigenous peoples have a better idea of what genetic research practices could be, and how can we move forward so that the policies that are existing can be of benefit to them. And so that prompted me to ask the question, what existing Indigenous genetic research policies are available? How do different countries with Indigenous peoples address these concerns? And how can tribes, especially in the United States, develop their own policies? And so that prompted initial work to look at an analysis of research policies in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States, which you see on the table up here. And we compared that to a document called the Indigenous Research Protection Act, which is a document that was created by the Indigenous Peoples Council on Biocolonialism. This document is not a legally binding act, it's just an aspirational guideline to which Indigenous peoples who put this together thought that it would be ideal or amazing to have such a document in place to help guide how research is conducted with Indigenous peoples. And so that was sort of like our model for looking at the way that the guidelines in these 4 countries address research with Indigenous peoples pertaining to community engagement, rights and interests, institutional responsibilities, and ethical and regulatory oversight. So I'm not going to go through the entire table, it's a bit busy, but what I wanted to highlight here is that we found that in Canada, a lot of the regulations that we were looking at were, when we look across the board, Canada is actually much more comprehensive in addressing these issues than other countries, and the United States has fallen quite far behind compared to some of these other countries. And so we were interested in understanding why that is and whether or not we might be able to help develop some guidelines or some guidance that can influence the way that research is conducted in the United States, whether this actually makes it to the level of influencing change to the common rule for human subjects regulations, or if it's just raising the awareness of what these issues are and how researchers can address them. So what are Indigenous data? Indigenous data is not just about genetic research, it's not just about biospecimens, but when thinking about Indigenous data, we also think about data from our non-human relations. This could be land, water, geology, air, soil, or other aspects of the environment. We also think about Indigenous data as being data about us as individuals. Sometimes this could be administrative, legal, health, social, commercial, corporate services, or other things. And we also think about data as collectives. So sometimes this could be traditional and cultural information that is passed on from generation to generation, languages, knowledge systems, ancestral and clan knowledges. Clan knowledges is how people recognize their relations to each other. And so how do we think about protecting how this data is used or shared in the global space? Is one of our motivations to think about what kinds of guidance could be in place to help dictate how data is used. So back in 2014, a non-Indigenous group came together to think about principles for sharing of data, large bodies of scientific data, and held a workshop called Jointly Designing a Data Fair Point that was held in the Netherlands. And here, academic and private stakeholders came together to think about their interest in finding ways to bring data together, promote data discovery, and think about reuse obstacles. So a lot of times when data are collected, they might go into one database or another database, and it might be difficult for researchers to access certain databases. So they were really trying to find ways to promote fair and open data science. And the goal here was to have a guiding principle and practices for data-intensive science. So they came up with the FAIR principles, which stand for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, as a way to promote how data is used and shared and is open for researchers to access. And the idea is that this could help to promote and advance science in a more meaningful way. But this also created some questions about how open data should be, and some of my colleagues came up with the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. And CARE stands for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And the idea here was that the CARE principles would be complementary to the FAIR principles. So we came up with this acronym, Be Fair and CARE. So even though these different principles might be seemingly incompatible and there might be questions about how you actually do FAIR and you do CARE together, we've been thinking about ways of looking at different Indigenous perspectives on genetics. We've been looking at different data policy or tribal policies to think about how we can layer on these two principles so that they are compatible with each other. And that led to some work with some international colleagues and I to think about Indigenous perspectives on genomics through a commentary that was, or a perspectives piece that was published in Nature Reviews Genetics, where in order to promote greater diversity and inclusion of Indigenous peoples in research, including genetic and genomic research, researchers really need to think about ways to build trust, enhance accountability, and improve equity. And to do that, building trust includes lots of early consultation, thinking about plans for data access, and receiving research updates, and exercising data governance. Enhancing accountability includes formalizing how data access is done and how secondary use agreements are created, as well as protecting different types of identifiers, thinking about appropriate study design, and preventing misuse of data, and also thinking about how publication standards should be operationalized and how researchers should think about what they publish. And then improving equity is really thinking about recognizing community rights and interests. So we call this a rights and interest paper because we think that understanding that is going to be really important in thinking about diversity and inclusion, as well as thinking about ways to collect appropriate cultural metadata, formalizing benefit sharing agreements, and enhancing capacity for making sure that this work is done within different communities. So we took the CARE principles, the thinking around Indigenous perspectives on genomic data, and the FAIR principles, and looked at tribal research codes across the country, and came up with 20 documents from 26 different tribal nations across the country that were legislative documents, public policies, procedures, and protocols, different types of documents that talk about how an application should be put together for a research review, as well as different forms and templates. And looked at how this maps onto the CARE principles to get a sense of whether or not tribal documents were actually written in a way that would address the CARE principles, or if there are gaps in what they are saying. And so I want to show a few quotes from the documents from the tribal research codes. And for collective benefit, the Cherokee Nation has a document that says the tribe will only support community engaged research practices, which requires a high level of collaboration with the Cherokee Nation. For authority to control, this is thinking about different ways of controlling information about their tribe. The 3 affiliated tribes in South Dakota have created a document that says this principle recognizes that the tribe and any human research subjects have the right to exclude from publication and or have kept confidential any information, including information concerning themselves, their health or culture, traditional knowledge, traditions, mythologies, or spiritual beliefs. And so here there is the idea that censorship can occur, that tribes do have the authority to decide whether something that is written up in publications should be published or not. And this is not unique to this tribe. Many different tribes have language that say that there needs to be pre-publication review before manuscripts are submitted for publication. For responsibility, the Kuruk tribe has an age-old tradition of reserving domains of knowledge for rightful and culturally appropriate owners, as well as restricting access to this knowledge during certain chronological periods as dictated by the time-honored Kuruk law. And so what this means is sometimes there is traditional knowledge that is passed down that can only be used at certain times of the year or in certain situations at certain parts of a person's lifetime. And this knowledge should not just be made openly available, it needs to be protected. So there's a recognition that this knowledge should be dealt with appropriately and responsibly. In thinking about ethics, the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians say that community knowledge, networks, and personal and political social power are other forms of equity that are useful to a project. Each of these commodities has value and must be shared between the researchers and the tribe if a proper agreement is to be formulated. And so here there's a sense that there must be equity in the research that is being conducted, and that there's value in all of the different aspects of the research and products that might be coming of that research project. So we were curious also to think about the CARE principles in the context of benefit sharing and genomic research, and took the 26 documents from these same 26 tribes and did another analysis looking at tribal expectations. And so we were looking at what these documents say about the tribal expectations for benefits of research, the tribal expectations for the collective, so that the entire tribe, and whether or not there is benefit or value or relevance to the community based on how the documents are written. Some of these documents also talk about historical and continuing lack of benefit as something that they are cautious of. The tribal codes sometimes have in the language saying that they are recognize historical abuses and they recognize that there might be a lack of benefit. And so they caution against research that might have a lack of benefit as well to them. Some of the documents also talk about balancing benefits and risks and harms, and putting restrictions on different types of ways of using the data, like commercialization and profit. And so the table that came out of this paper was very massive and very long, so I tried to distill it down into something that was a little bit more manageable, where in looking at collective benefit, we created codes across, we created a code book, and across that we had codes for collective benefit that include compensation, royalties, benefits, lack of benefit, and health. And then in the last column over, under actions for institutions and researchers, we took what the research codes were saying about these different aspects and tried to turn it into a recommendation for researchers and institutions to follow. Because one of the questions and one of the challenges that we have faced quite often is that there's researchers and institutions have said there's this whole body of work, there's all of these research codes. How do we actually take that information and move beyond it to actually do something so that it can impact the way that, so that it can impact the way that we do research? Or if there's all of these restrictions on research, can we even move forward in doing the research or not? So we tried to distill it in a way that is framed such that, okay, here are the issues that are raised by the communities, issues that are raised by the tribal research codes, and here's what you can do about it. And in these actions for researchers, these are just buzzwords that I'm putting here, so it doesn't really give you a sense of what we were actually saying, but we did describe how research can have monetary benefits. Maybe there are ways that money can flow back to the community based on how grants are written or how the research is structured. Really thinking about authorship, like including community members as authors and offering different ways of engaging them in the research through employment or technical assistance. And so I won't go through the entire list here, but what I wanted to point out here is for under authority to control, for example, there was a lot of discussion about commercialization, intellectual property, trying to protect intellectual property, thinking about return of findings, and making sure that people are authors or are recognized as authors or contributors to the research. And so there's a lot of discussion in a lot of these research codes about how to have agreements and restrictions on commercialization or profits. And there's a lot of tools that are developed from different tribes for legal agreements, permits, and licensing and authorship. Some tribes have model language for how to think about commercialization or return of profits back to the community, and there needs to be certain kinds of agreements in place in order for the research to proceed if there is expected to be profits as a part of that research. With responsibility, a lot of the tribal research codes talk about inclusion of tribal ideas, values, language, and voices, and that they also ask, some of the research codes all actually ask for assistance with grants, training materials, and asking researchers to donate equipment after a research project has ended. So these are some examples of ways that researchers can give back to communities, even if they are not giving back monetary information. They can perhaps donate equipment after the research project has ended. So a lot of this work is still ongoing, where we're still thinking about how to move this into practice or move this into a way that is not entirely overwhelming to researchers and institutions, but is a way that can really facilitate better communication between tribes and researchers who want to engage in research. The CARE principles have also been applied to other areas, including ecology and biodiversity. So one of my colleagues has a graduate student in her lab who is an ecologist and does a lot of work with water samples and soil samples. And we worked to think about the CARE principles and how this might apply in that setting, as well as thinking about responsible ways of actually doing ecological research that is meaningful and of benefit to communities. One of the things that was really exciting and inspiring to me was when we had this paper published, we actually included a land acknowledgement in our affiliations, which to my knowledge, this is the first time that any academic medical journal or any academic journal has done so, and the editors were very receptive to this idea of including the land acknowledgement of each of the contributing authors to this paper. We're now in a little bit of a battle with other journals to see if we can do this in other journals too, so we'll see how that turns out. But it was really neat to see that they were very receptive to the idea of including the lands of all of the universities that we each work on. So thinking about what this all means in terms of enriching metadata, enriching use of samples, enriching different ways of using the information, we have been really thinking about what it means to work at the intersection of care and fair, that we want to be, that we really want to be in this upper circle of care and fair, where we think about the alignment of these different things, but oftentimes other parts of research might fall into the lower half of the circle. And so how do we move all of that back to the upper half of the circle? So we're really working on different ways of thinking about really understanding where data come from with provenance, thinking about the permissions of how this data can be used, who can use it, and in what context and what kind of protocols should be in place. So one of the other things that we are working on is thinking about how we can move this to the space where large genomics consortium are thinking about engaging people from around the world in these large databases, and they are already implementing the FAIR principles to try to make data findable, reusable, interoperable, and accessible. Sorry, I got that acronym kind of mixed up there. But how do they implement the FAIR principles with and recognize that they really need to think about who these individual people are who are contributing to those databases. So I've been doing some work with the Human Pan Genome Reference Consortium to think about aligning the ongoing work with the FAIR principles. And by doing this, we are trying to think about ways to truly engage and demonstrate respect for different marginalized, impacted, excluded, and underserved populations. And so with the analysis of the 26 from the research codes from the 26 different federally recognized tribes, a lot of this work is really informing us to think about how we need to think about supporting tribal law, policy, and jurisdiction. And then when there are no laws in place, in the absence of laws, research institutions, researchers, and funders should really engage with tribes or with different communities to think about ways to obtain approvals and guidance for the research data and oversight. And we are also advocating for more ways to increase the amount of training that researchers need to really understand what it means to do data, to do research in this age where there is a push for increased Indigenous data governance and data oversight to make sure that research is done appropriately and is not in conflict with existing values and laws. Some of this work is also motivating me to think about what it means when individual tribes restrict research with biospecimens. And this work is ongoing with the Navajo Nation, which is the tribe that I am a member of, where the Navajo Nation approved a moratorium on genetic research studies until such a time that a Navajo Nation research code has been amended by the Navajo Nation Council. And this was passed in April 2002. So now here we are 21 years later, and the moratorium is still in place. And additional resolutions were really focused on making sure that the Navajo Nation has developed and approved a policy statement on genetic research. So some of my, excuse me, some of my colleagues and I are working to actively address that by developing a genetic research policy. A lot of that is informed by the previous work that I just showed to think about how to make a robust policy for the tribe. And the tribe also approved and authorized a genetic policy development working group, where we have different subcommittees that look at oversight, rules, and regulations, as well as cultural, traditional, and values, and thinking about what this means in the context of genetics and data sharing, while also doing efforts to do education and outreach to the public by making sure that the public is understanding of what is going on. And so developing this tribal research policy has been important. It's been important to identify gaps in these other existing national and tribal policies, and also receiving community input to understand people's concerns. A lot of this is also motivated and driven by some data-informed work where we have conducted surveys and interviews and deliberations with community members to understand what their perspectives are, and if they have recommendations for the policy, what those recommendations would be. And a lot of the outwork that we have done has been through radio forums, conferences, workshops, and even DNA extraction exercises with strawberries, which has been a lot of fun. So, and to kind of bring all of this together and think about what this means, a lot of this is still very much ongoing, and we're still trying to figure out how to move all of this into practice. But some of the overarching themes that we see as coming together, and we're hoping that this can help us to think about building a model for doing this type of work, is really to support Indigenous community data sovereignty, consult and engage community leaders, engage community members in the research process, including how to interpret the data, what the data means to the community, support capacity building of minority scientists and community members, listen to a range of perspectives, including oral histories. And I think this is a piece that often gets left out, thinking about the oral histories of how people understand their relationship to each other or to the land, or what research findings might mean in the context of who they are and what their understanding of who they are has largely been left out. And there could be very important and impactful ways to shape the research question and the research interpretations if oral histories are also considered. And also thinking about understanding hesitations, reluctance, and skepticism to research. Sometimes people might not want to participate, and there could be a whole host of reasons why. And by understanding what those reasons are, a researcher can become more informed, or they might be able to address some of those concerns and help move forward. Excuse me. And then finally, creating space to hear concerns, issues, or suggestions. Sometimes this can be difficult for researchers who have an idea of how research should be conducted, and to be in a space where there might be some pushback, or some people might have some different ways of how this should move forward, can be sometimes difficult, but to be able to be open can also be more inviting in the end for research to move forward. So I just want to end by acknowledging the many people who have been involved in this work and who have helped to influence and shape my thinking around this work. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Questions in the room?
Yeah.
I was struck by this yesterday and today, the slide that you just showed with the strategies for engagement, the point about engaging people on interpretation of results or data. I think that is really fascinating, and I haven't seen that as a common point at which engagement has been sought. And so I'm curious about what inspired you to include that point, and what, if any, experiences there have been so far with that.
Yeah. So that's the thing that inspired me to include that point was when some research was done involving ancient DNA with ancient ancestors near a specific tribal community. The researchers had ideas about how these ancestors were related to people who are currently living in that area, and made a lot of assumptions about the role of women in that society, that if they had just talked to people who were in that region, they may have had a very different interpretation. So they were making a lot of assumptions about the roles that women had in that society, in that ancient society, that were not entirely compatible with how people currently living in that region think about the role of women. So they would have probably arrived at a very different interpretation had they involved community members. So that was the motivation behind it. I have also seen instances where a lot of community members come into a research project where they might say, well, excuse me, well, maybe you should think about it in this other way, or maybe there are pieces that you're missing, or there's this cultural story that might help you think about why this is important. So having the additional context has been really helpful in some circumstances. But I haven't seen this actually play out a whole lot, but that's sort of the background for why we are advocating for this.
So there is a lot of data already out there. So is there a way that you imagine kind of looking at like work that's already been done and then kind of apply the care principles from that? I know like this is kind of going forward, but there is a lot of information that's out there that might not be fully consented to. or like what work is being done with it in incentive two?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We have not yet looked at other ongoing existing work to see how the care principles map onto that. The closest we've done is just looking at the existing tribal research codes. In the work that I'm doing with the Human Pan-Genome Reference Consortium, I think that will be an opportunity for us to see how the care principles see if we can apply or map the care principles onto how the project has already been structured and what has already been done in that context. And then maybe by doing that, we might be able to say, here are some areas of improvement or some gaps, or here's where you're doing it really great, a really great job. So that will probably be the first time that we apply the care principle to an ongoing project. But the care principles are also very new, so there's a lot of opportunity to do that.
I had a question about circumstances where in one of your previous slides, I think it was on the care principle slides related to control. There was the example given of tribes retaining control over the ability to publish and review data. And your response to Kate might be one example where that might have come up where they said, oh, we've reviewed this and your interpretation is incorrect. Are there other examples? I guess I'm wondering how frequently that might actually be exerted. Because you could imagine it scaring people away in a way that perhaps is people are overly worried about the level of control that would be exerted that could make them less desirous to do research involving tribal populations. So I guess I'm just wondering maybe if there are other examples where that right has been exerted.
Yeah, so the examples I'm aware of are all anecdotal, and some of them are from personal experiences, because I don't think anybody really catalogs the number of instances that this happens. But I'm also on the Navajo Nation Human Research Review Board, and that which is in the Navajo IRB, and they also do require pre-publication review. So I myself or other members of the IRB have flagged papers in the past where something was said that maybe was slightly insensitive or lacked some context or was incorrect or inaccurate. And so we were able to flag those instances and ask the authors to revise the paper before submission to a journal. But the number of times it happens, it's probably something on the order of like 1 or 2%. It's not very often, but when it does happen, I think people feel good that they were able to make some corrections or assurances that certain kinds of information are described appropriately for the community.
But I have so many questions, but start with one. It relates to this issue. One of the points of problems that came up in the Havasupai case was the difference between the migration story or the origin story that the tribe had and what the genomic data said about relationships and migration and that sort of thing were incompatible with narratives from the genomics and from the tribe. How do you think about sort of navigating those sorts of tensions where the scientific data say X and the tribe's self-understanding, cultural understanding, et cetera, says Y, and you can't reconcile those two things? How can one possibly navigate that situation?
I think to reconcile that, there could be more conversations with cultural and traditional leaders in the community to say, okay, here's what the scientific data are saying. Are there things that you are concerned about how this is being said, and how can we rewrite this in a way that is compatible with your views? I think with ancestry and migration studies, it's more difficult because some people have very strong beliefs and about their origins and where they come from, and many different stories talk about how certain people come from different parts of the land, or maybe they emerge from the land. Other groups actually have historical oral stories about how they migrated over large bodies of water. So each group has a different view of where they come from. And so you might get a different response across different groups. And so I think having that conversation is very important. I think a lot of proposed research around ancestry and migration today would not get approved by certain groups. So I don't think we would run into that problem as often as it has been in the past. In the past, a lot of that research was conducted without community knowledge or consent. So there is a lot of concern about how data are used once the data are collected, if the community has no idea, you know, what is being done with that data and those samples. So a lot of the ancestry and migration studies were conducted 10, 15, 20 years ago, and there's been a lot more effort to curb or stop that kind of research, as long as, I mean, if the community feels that it's incompatible. There are instances though where different types of there are instances of genetic anthropologists working with different tribal communities in different places who are interested in moving ancestral remains from one location to another due to climate change, you know, erosion of the landscape, and maybe their ancestors are becoming uncovered. And so they want to move their ancestors to another location. And in some cases, the tribe has allowed or even invited researchers to come in and do some genetic analyses of those remains during the process of that of moving it from one place to another. So, and in those cases, every group has a different motivation for doing it. Some groups want to be able to use it for, to use that information to bolster their claims to the land and that they belong to the land. Others are just interested in understanding how they are related to each other. So they all have very different reasons for doing it. But I wouldn't say that all tribes would be interested in that kind of work.
On the slide that you just that had the different Indigenous and policies for research, I noticed that one of them was the SAN policy, and it made me wonder how much overlap is there across the globe with regard to Indigenous responses to research, and how much are the issues distinct to in the US, for example?
Yeah. We haven't done that type of analysis yet, but it would be really interesting to do. So the person who collected all of those research codes has that collection and is trying to figure out what to do with it. And I think doing that sort of analysis would be really interesting and important. Some of the research codes that we have also come from Australia, New Zealand, Mexico, Canada, and they pertain to Indigenous peoples too in those places. So, but I think that the challenge here is that there's no unifying structure or format, and some of the documents are more like a framework for doing ethical research, and others are an actual code that is legally binding, and there's everything in between. So it's hard to have a systematic approach to looking at all of them. But the SAN were included because they have different kinds of instructions about how research should be conducted and what information can be shared or not shared. And some of that is similar to what we see in research codes from other Indigenous groups around the world too.
Do you want to ask any of your other questions?
Happy to ask another question, because like I said, I've so many. So this takes you a little beyond what you talked about, but you said or implied a number of points that having people who are members of research teams who are themselves Indigenous seems like an advantage for research. And I'm wondering if either you or others have done any work on sort of understanding the experience of people who are themselves Indigenous, who are members of both the community that's being studied, but also members of the research team that's doing the studying. Because I can imagine that it would be a very interesting, or could be a very interesting and challenging kind of set of roles to play.
Yeah. So I didn't mention this at all, but I'm also part of the summer internship for Indigenous peoples and genomics. And we have an NSF grant that I am one of the PIs on to look at the impact of the summer internship for Indigenous peoples workshop And this is a workshop that started in 2010 and has been held almost annually with some interruptions with COVID and other things, to bring together Indigenous scientists, undergraduate, everywhere from the undergraduate to the tribal leader level and professional, to engage in wet lab and dry lab genetic work for a week, as well as thinking about the ethical social implications of their work. And so this grant that we have is to look at the impact of the SING program and also conduct a social network analysis to see how people are collaborating as a result of their participation in SING. We did conduct some focus groups where we asked people what the impact has been on their professional and personal work as well. I mean, professional careers and their personal work. So hopefully that will help us glean some insight into what it has been like for their involvement in conducting research as an Indigenous scientist. It's not exactly answering your question, but I think that this is the closest thing we have to getting a sense of what their experiences have been. But the number of Indigenous peoples in genetics labs is still relatively small. Yeah.
I have a quick question. I saw that, I apologize for coming in late, I have my mask over there. But you mentioned there was about 26 tribes that were working to build guidelines. Of those 26, I'm just curious, are most of those tribes or nations with reservations that are marked, or are those that are not reservation, that don't have a reservation? I'm curious how that would look.
I believe they all have reservations with tribal governments they're all federally recognized tribes. So I think that they all have reservations and governments set up to dictate how research is conducted on their lands.
They are traditional.
Yeah. We actually found a small number of documents from unrecognized tribes, and that was not included in that list.
I was just curious if tribes that didn't have reservations that are more closer to urban cities were more receptive to something like this. And then two, if that having a relationship with the institution, university, for instance, here in Pennsylvania, there are no federally state or state recognized tribes. So we don't have, relationships with tribes nearby. And I'm sure that helps and assists with that research, right?
Yeah, that's probably, I'm sure there's a difference there too. Yeah.
Okay, with that, we will thank you for a great talk.
Thanks.